Thank you for joining me. So I just thought we'd have a quick chat about the show and how it came to be, and a little bit about yourself as well. Um,
Sure.
so to start off, I saw you're an award-winning producer and actor. So how did you
Well,
the show?
I'm a Broadway writer and performer, and I also do direct and write music and other things as well. So, yeah, primarily based out of New York, and I'm very fortunate to have gotten to do a lot of work over there.
So how did you end up into writing and sort of developing shows?
Um, it's something that I kind of always did. Like I was that weird kid that when I was little, all I would want to do is put on shows in the living room. And I would be like directing other people and making up stories and giving them lines to say and things like that. And I was really fortunate. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. So really great place to pursue doing this. And I started performing professionally when I was about 5. And I wrote my first show for my third grade class when I was 8. So it's something that's kind of always gone hand in hand. And I started pursuing a professional career as a performer and was always writing. And I had my first show produced when I was 17, and have been fortunate to have wonderful mentors and to have some success with it, and people liked what I was doing, and it's sort of just grown from there. And I went to NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. I actually have performed in the UK. I did the international tour of a show when I was younger and played London, Warwick, and Stratford, and got to study at RADA and the National Theatre while I was there. And I love the UK very, very much. I'm actually about to have the UK premiere of a play of mine called Snow through the South Devon Players on their virtual season right now. And I went to NYU's Tisch School of the Arts for uni, and then just sort of stayed and continued pursuing my career out in New York.
How did the idea of spectacle come about?
Spectacle kind of started out as a little that I would joke about when I was hanging out with my friends, because I mean, it's been going on since the 80s, really, but I've, watched, as we all have, sort of the rise of the spectacle musical in Broadway theater and, the West End and stuff like that. And so I don't know, we just get silly, and I would just start joking about the new crazy musical that was coming about, like, oh, did you hear, the end of Act 1 is they're gonna have a full-size boat on stage, and it's gonna hit an iceberg, and it's gonna sink, and then they're gonna flood the theater, and the entirety of the opening number of Act 2 will take place entirely underwater, and the audience will be given masks and regulators. So it was just me like continuing to joke about more and more insane things, like, well, Phantom has 1 chandelier, they're gonna have 5, and the end of the show, the ceiling's gonna blow. And it was just sort of making fun at how big and insane things were getting. And then at some point, I think I joked that it would, because I always kind of wanted to write it because I just thought it would be hilarious and silly to see what that musical would be. But then I don't know, I got the idea of like, what if, because clearly nobody would ever actually do that show, nor should they, but how hilarious would it be if you got 2 people in a black box with no tech whatsoever, and they're pitching this show. So it's like them, like all in black with a piano and nothing else, talking about like the most spectacle driven show that's ever happened in Broadway history. And so that's where I got the idea from. And then I went on to have success with my pieces. I wrote the Twilight parody musical that played at New World Stages. I don't just write parody stuff. I have a really wonderful musical called Lyra that was created in collaboration with Broadway and Cirque du Soleil artists, a very serious show. I've contributed to a lot of other things. I have, straight plays that I've gotten a bit of a reputation for. And my go-to collaborator is the wonderful composer Evan J. Newman, and we wrote Lyra together. We've worked on some other things. And one day, I think we had actually just done an interview for something. And I was like, did I ever tell you my idea for Spectacle, the musical? And he's like, no. And I told him about it. And the thing is, I'm a performer and Evan's a performer. Evan started out as a Broadway child performer, like in Les Mis playing Gavroche. And so he's a rare breed where he's a wonderful performer, also a brilliant composer, and pianist. And I was like, it might be really interesting if we wrote this show and then we played versions of ourselves in it, because you can play everything. We're both performers, and it'll be like this real meta thing where we're playing versions of Ashley and Evan. And so we wrote it. In all honesty, this happened pretty fast. We wrote it. Well, I'm a very fast writer. I wrote the libretto in like, I don't know, 6 days or something like that. And then Evan wrote the score. Well, let me rephrase. I wrote the book and lyrics, and then he wrote the music, which is how we tend to work. I tend to hand in like full librettos, and then he does the music. And we did a reading of it at the Access Theater Company in New York a summer ago. And then we started doing development, and we had a production and had the opportunity to do a wonderful cast album for it, which we had fun with playing with the meta nature of the album, because the show is meant to be like not an investor's pitch, because the idea is they already have the $200 million for the show, but it's like an investor's presentation of like, this is what your money is buying. So we wanted to keep that feeling with the album. So it's all the songs from the show, but we included a couple select interludes where we keep the meta nature going. We say that, our crazy producer is making us do a demo album because he wants us to create a fan base like Be More Chill. So some of that meta nature is in there. But you can also skip that and just listen to the songs as well in it. So, yeah.
You touched on the the introduction and the interludes. Is that part of the show, or is that just on the cast album?
The way that it exists on the album was just for the album. I wrote a script for just the album. So the way that the show works is it starts with Evan and I coming out. We're wearing show shirts for The Sound of Love, and we treat the audience like they're investors in the show. So they have fake investor packets with how like the $200 million is being used. And we treat it like an investor's presentation. So we do talk to the audience, we do explain things that are happening in the show, but then we perform select scenes and songs from the show. So you're getting like a highlights overview of The Sound of Love. So you do learn the story of the show from beginning to end. But in between there, we talk to the audience a little bit. Evan and I get in some fights. Our producer, Frank Reiger, starts having issues with some things. And ultimately, really what I wanted the show to be about was sort of, without not meaning to sound like highfalutin about it, but the nature of art and why we create art. Because I've seen, as I just said, I've seen art and musicals and whatnot go down this really intense path where sometimes the spectacle is great and it's needed and it's a wonderful addition to the show, and sometimes it's there just because they think it's going to sell tickets. And so really what the show becomes is it becomes a discussion between Evan and I about sort of what are you willing to sacrifice to be successful? What is, to quote Stephen Sondheim, what is the state of the art? And we get into some like actual discussions about the fact that the versions of ourselves that we're playing, we're starving artists until Frank showed up. If we abandon this show, we're going back to being starving artists who can't pay the bills. How do you create really good art that's also commercially and financially viable? And we don't like necessarily offer hard answers to those questions, but we have a discussion, which is a discussion that doesn't really seem to be happening in the artistic medium. It seems to be something more that is discussed, by artists behind closed doors a little bit. So that really becomes the whole thing. So the songs in the show start to have double meanings. Like the song The Ends Justify the Means within a show is the villain's 11 o'clock number, but it's also Evan kind of coming to terms with what he's willing to sacrifice in order to have his dream come true. And so it becomes a discussion about what's going on with art and what our responsibility is as artists and what solutions there might be moving forward in the commercial medium is sort of ultimately what it's about. But it's really funny along the way and is a send up of a lot of other shows and things of that nature.
You talked about other shows. When I was listening to it, I noticed that there's quite a lot of, I heard a lot of references to other shows. A lot for Les Mis, a bit of Hairspray, I think. Were those intentionally put in, or were they like?
It is all intentional. It's 100% intentional. And what we nothing is like ripped off or anything. It's like subtle parody homages. But the way that we sort of deal with it in the show is that the backstory, as it were, is that Evan and I wrote an actual very moving, intimate musical that Frank then saw and was like, with a few tweaks, this could be a big multi-million-dollar hit on Broadway. And so the idea is that Frank is constantly like, well, wait, Phantom's really successful. You got to throw some of that stuff in there. And this is really successful. You got to throw some of that. So it's the idea that Frank, this mysterious Frank producer, doesn't really care about artistic integrity. He just cares about if something was successful before use it. And then we also had a lot of fun because, we love and adore musical theater. So there are definitely a lot of references in there, loving references to things. But yeah, no, those are all very intentional.
Yeah. Kind of it also, in a sense, the characters are drawing on their experiences as well as you drawing on your references and experiences. So in that, it's incredibly clever.
Thank you.
I saw that it premiered at the Triad. We had your premiere night. How did that go? How was it?
It was incredible. We were completely sold out for all of our shows, and had wonderful, very responsive audiences. It was interesting because one of the questions that Evan and I had when we were developing the piece was we wanted to make it accessible and entertaining for people who weren't necessarily musical theater fans. We didn't want you to have to be in on the joke, as it were, to get it. And I remember our first couple nights, one night we had a group that was all musical theater insiders. And the next night we had a group that nobody was a musical theater insider. And it was really exciting because they both really enjoyed it. And there was lots of laughter, and there were moments that stopped the show that were amazing. And some of them were in the same places and some of them were in different places, but everybody seemed to really enjoy it, whether or not they knew the inside references, which is great because ultimately what the show is about is integrity and art and going after your dream. And I think that that's something everybody can relate to, regardless of what industry they're in. So we were very fortunate. It's been very successful, and the cast album has been successful as well. So, we're now in the middle of COVID and quarantine and whatnot, but we're really excited to look at how it's going to be coming back in the future. So, yeah.
What was it like to open a brand new musical that essentially no one's seen before? Was there added stress to put on this brand new show?
I think there's always added stress with it, but Evan and I very much believe in the development process. So it's not a case of we wrote this thing and now this is the first time people are going to hear it. Before it ever went up, we had many readings of it. We'd had development of it. So we had a pretty decently strong idea of where it was. But putting something up in front of people for the very first time is always nerve-wracking, and putting something up in front of any audience is always nerve-wracking. You never know how they're going to exactly respond, but it wasn't like an out of the blue thing. We'd done extensive development on it. So we felt pretty solid going into it. It's just, it's a beast of a show in that it's the two of us on stage the entire time. We have a wonderful third character who comes in, Lucy, who's Frank's niece, who he's forced to be in the show, who the actress playing her is extremely talented, but Lucy maybe is not the most talented person. So she's wonderful, but with the exception of her, it's kind of Evan and me, just two people sustaining a show the whole time, and that it's a lot. So that was interesting, sort of going out there and doing that for the first time. And we pull at all the stops, kind of any special skills that we personally had, we use. So I'm tap dancing and doing lots of stuff, and he's doing all his amazing things on the keyboard and playing 12 different characters and changing hats. It's been described as title of show meets the play that goes wrong, which I think is a very accurate statement.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Sorry,
Could you please...
Siri thought that I said her name, which I did not. But yeah, so it's it's always a lot when you're premiering a show for the first time, but it was wonderful and very successful, and we're really excited to continue on with it in many different ways and venues.
So talking more on how it's going to go on, what's next for you? What's next for the show?
Yeah, well, I mean, the world has kind of stopped, so we're in a bit of a holding pattern. We're definitely in talks for next steps with Spectacle, but you know, in the States, things aren't great, and it's looking like, I mean, I'm also a Broadway person. You know, my source of income was from Broadway, which is now the earliest it's looking like that's going to come back is spring of 2021, and that's if things go well. So we're not making really any specific plans because we're waiting to see what happens in terms of theaters opening up. We have been talking about adapting it into a companion web series. We definitely want to put it up again. The fun thing about it, if anybody out there is interested, it's a super easy show to put up. I mean, all of the props fit in my little wheelie suitcase, and then Evan has his keyboard, and that's all we need to do the show. We can literally take it anywhere. So if anybody would like for us to come and do the show, we can very easily come and do that. But there are plans to bring it back as soon as things get a little bit better with COVID. But in terms of me specifically, my play Snow is going up virtually with the South Devon Players virtual season on October 2nd with some incredible Broadway performers in it. So if you go to my website, there's information on it. It's ashleygriffinofficial.com. But also if you go to the South Devon Players, there's information there if you'd like to see a virtual piece of mine that is not a comedy. It's very, very dark and serious. And then a lot of my work was kind of put on hold. I was supposed to have a show of mine open off Broadway actually right now, and that clearly isn't happening. But yeah, so I'm sort of just in a holding pattern, and I'm continuing to do virtual development on pieces and whatnot. But in terms of things happening live, you know, it's sort of a wait and see kind of a thing. But in the meantime, you can go out and get the cast album and get a really good feel for the show. And I think it's a very funny, lighthearted thing that hopefully can give you some joy right now when it's kind of a very depressing time. So it's a little something that can make you smile. But yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much for joining me. I've had a ball. Like you said, people can stream the album, get it online on Spotify, iTunes. But yes, thank you so much for joining me. And I hope everything gets sorted as soon as possible.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and you as well. And thank you for your wonderful album reviews and spreading the word about new musical works.
Thank you very much.